I'm so happy to introduce to you Jeff Kiderman. Jeff works with a special project called the Affordable Jewish Education Project, ageproject.org. And Jeff is on a mission to make your school tuition $10,000 a year for K through 4, and then maybe even middle school. So why is he here talking about Judaism in the 21st century? Because there won't be Judaism in the 21st century if tuition continues to go up. But truth be told, we didn't bring Jeff here to kvetch about tuition. We brought Jeff here because the way he's doing it is very interesting to me and should be interesting to all of us and our educators. The AGE project and Jeff, and I must tell you, he comes well decorated with a degree from Wharton, if I'm not mistaken, and plenty of background in education. Jeff has a little belief that by using the gifts of technology that we have today, and by using progressive educational models and classroom designs, we can not only cheapen tuition, which is it is the ultimate objective, but getting there is a lot more. We can enhance the educational experience for our children and be highly more efficient. I'll let Jeff give his own talk, but I'm thankful that you made the trip from Manhattan to be here with us, and thank you in advance for sharing. Jeff will be here to take questions, of course, and if he wants to stick around for our panel, he is an educator and should definitely stick around for the Q&A with Vivian. So, with no further ado, please give your attention to Mr. Kiderman.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks for the invitation. This is a beautiful event on a very important topic. And how many people have been here like multiple nights this week? Wow. Okay, amazing. So I'm a little bit of a visual learner myself. So I hope you can see the screen because there's going to be a lot of slides. So first of all, a little bit about myself in logos. So day school graduate from Westchester originally, went to Ramaz Yeshiva in Israel, degrees in management, computer science, and education, which is kind of probably a combination you don't see very often. I was actually a marketing consultant. That is not Rosetta Stone, which is a language teaching company. I was a marketing consultant for companies looking to personalize their online marketing experiences for their customers, which is very relevant to what I do now. I taught AP Computer Science, and now, as Jeffrey said, I'm the Executive Director of Affordable Jewish Education Project, co-founder of Two Sigma Education. We will get into explaining what that is, but overall, my job is to try to improve Jewish day school quality while lowering costs at the same time, and we will get into how we try to do that. But the topic for today that I was asked to speak about is keeping Jewish day schools current in the 21st century. So we're gonna kind of I beta did this here. We're gonna try to kind of break this down into different components, give a little background, and then come up with some ideas. Okay, so this is the Avichai Foundation's census that they do every 5 years of Jewish day schools. The last one was in 2013, 2014. And so I think any conversation about day schools as a whole should come with an understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So according to this census, there are 861 Jewish day schools, or at least there were a few years ago, approximately 250,000 students. And if you look at it, however, over 60% of those students are going to schools that would be called either yeshiva or Hasidic. And one might argue that in many, if not most, if not close to all of these schools, the challenge of staying current in the 21st century is probably not as much the challenge that they are trying to accomplish. And you might even, some of these little categories might also fit into that depending on their different types of Chabad schools, their different types of outreach schools, etc. But if we think about classic Jewish day schools, talking about centrist Orthodox, modern Orthodox, conservative, reform, non-denominational, we're talking about approximately 300 schools and approximately 80,000 students. Now to put that into context of general public school education, that is 1/6 of 1% of students in the United States. And just as comparison, if you consider the entire non-yeshivish Jewish day school system to be one public school district, it would not even make it into the top 40 in terms of public school districts in the U.S. So in the grand scheme of things, this is a very small population, a very small phenomenon of Jewish day schools, but it's also very important because attending Jewish day school, research has shown, as opposed to public or independent private schools, is significantly correlated with perceived importance of being Jewish, involvement in Jewish life on campus, including Hillel, strong connections to other Jewish students on campus, dating pools that are strictly Jewish, and knowledge and understanding of Israel. But the impact doesn't end in college. It continues into adulthood because adults who attend Jewish day schools have been shown to be significantly more likely to marry Jewish, to engage in Jewish rituals, to become members of Jewish synagogues, feel an attachment to Israel, and to overall rate being Jewish as, quote, very important to them. And these results are true even after controlling for what type of Jewish home you grew up in before you entered Jewish day school. So now we have a little bit of a sense of Jewish day schools, what they are, why they're important. Let's talk about what we mean by current. And first, I guess we should note that if we're trying to keep them current, I guess the assumption would be that they're not. And in this case, frankly, I don't think there's necessarily much of a distinction between Jewish day schools and the rest of United States education. Schools in general are a little bit behind, and in some cases, very far behind the rest of society. And I wanted to discuss maybe a few reasons why that might be the case. First of all, education is huge. Okay, so we only have 80,000 students, but U.S. education is 50 million students, 70,000 public schools, 3.5 million teachers. We're talking about a massive system, so trying to change a system like that is not so simple. Second, it's mostly run by the government. And to the extent that it's not run by the government, it's partially regulated by the government, partially funded by the government, and other schools tend to follow, in many ways, what the government-run schools, which are the huge majority of schools, what they do. And without getting into politics, this isn't necessarily a great recipe for rapid innovation and change. Actually, a report earlier this year revealed that the U.S. Defense Department is still using 8-inch floppy disks to coordinate the functions of our nuclear missiles. No, I couldn't make that up if I tried. I'm not that creative. And I also think there's a possible negative side effect that comes from the fact that everyone in education actually was at one point a consumer of education as a student, except not now, but quite a while ago. So the average teacher was in school in the 80s, in high school in the 80s, and started elementary school in the 70s. And the average principal is 5 to 10 years older than that. And it's probably more likely than not that not only did they obviously go to school, they probably enjoyed it and excelled. And in many cases, although not all, there are exceptions, it worked for them, right? That's why they came to love schools and love education and go into education and go into it as a profession. Even their training was in the 90s, right? So I think there are other reasons as well. I'm not blaming this exclusively on that. Just an interesting comparison between hospitals. There's so many interesting comparisons between healthcare and education. Think about how many hospitals actually serve multiple functions. In addition to treating patients, they also train doctors, conduct research. Now, think about how many schools educate kids, conduct research, and train future teachers. And it'd be hard to think of one. And I think that's significant because it results in a much slower feedback loop between researchers and practitioners in education. Because often we think of education as something that's just kind of natural, and some people are good at it and have a knack for it and it's intuitive, etc. But in some cases it's not necessarily the case. Education is a science. At least many aspects of education relate back to science, and that science, just like any other science, that science changes and develops and grows over time. And there are some things in education that might be intuitive to us, but they're actually, the research will actually show the opposite. So and there isn't really such a good way for information to flow into schools like it may be in other fields. So back to the issue of being current. So what do we mean by current? I think there are at least 3 different definitions of what we could mean when we ask, are schools current, or how do we make schools more current? Number 1 is current in the sense that we want schools to be engaging and relevant for today's current children. And today's current children, forget millennials, today's current children are what we call Generation Z, and I'm really excited to see what comes after Z. I think there was a lack of foresight there. And these are kids who never experienced the world without the internet, and in fact, spend more time on their cell phones than they do watching TV. This is a very new and different generation, even than the millennials, who in some cases are now already the parents of Jewish day school students. Number 2 is definition of current would be making schools as sophisticated and as modern as other institutions that we're used to in our lives and that we take for granted, things that we take for granted in day-to-day life that we cannot take for granted in education. So a few months ago, I was driving at about 5 p.m. on a Thursday, and I was in a rush, and there were a lot of cars, and I made a left turn from a right turn only lane, and I got pulled over. 5 p.m. on Thursday. Friday, I come home from work, and I have a pile of letters from lawyers offering to defend me in court. Less than 24 hours later, right? That's how fast today's society works in terms of data. And Waze gives you a warning when you need to leave for your next meeting based on traffic, and AccuWeather tells you in exactly how many minutes it's going to rain, and you can actually order a new round of laundry detergent straight from your washing machine by pressing an Amazon Dash button. So we're talking about a world that's fast-paced, that's on-demand, that's driven, that's personalized, and I'm not sure we would be able to call any of our schools or many of our schools by these names. Except I want to push current a little bit further, because these definitions of current in education might not even be good enough. This is my son. He's 2, otherwise known as high school class of 2031. And what we're preparing our students for is not 2016, unless they're in 12th grade, right? Or even then, they're gonna hopefully go to college and so push it off a few years. We're preparing our elementary school students for the 2030s. And I have no idea what the world's gonna look like in the 2030s, but here's what I do know. The world isn't just moving quickly, it's accelerating. Okay, so here's a fascinating, what they call the knowledge doubling curve by Buckminster Fuller, which basically states that, if you can read the fine print here, that human knowledge used to double every century, then it was doubling every 25 years, and now human knowledge doubles every 13 months, and pretty soon, once every single thing that you touch is connected to the internet, including the chairs and the floor and the chandeliers, etc., every 12 hours, okay? And I decided just for fun to look up some predictions for what the world will be like in 2030, and I have absolutely no idea if any of these predictions will come true, but just to give you an idea of what some people say, if even a portion of these things come true by 2030, the world will be a very different place. So I'm gonna rattle off a bunch. Internet access and literacy will be almost universal. Almost 100% of the people in the world will be literate. We will be building buildings that are twice the size of one World Trade Center. We will be able to 3D print human organs. Machines will replace 80% of doctors, and nanobots in our bodies will actually supplement our immune systems. Self-driving cars will dominate the road. According to Elon Musk, it'll actually be illegal by 2030 to drive your own car, because that would be considered unsafe. Half the shopping malls in the US will have been replaced by internet shopping and 3D printing. White-collar jobs will be mostly automated, and 1/4 of US soldiers will be replaced by robots. And the entire Human Genome Project will be performed in seconds. Or, in the context of education, 65% of children entering elementary school today will ultimately end up working in jobs that do not exist yet. Types of jobs, names of jobs that do not exist yet, which is kind of crazy to fathom. And you can just, to think about this, right? Think about the jobs today that didn't exist when we were kids, right? So you have data scientist, digital artist, app developer, virtual assistant, blogger, right? These are all new jobs that lots of people have that never really existed until recently. So current in education isn't quite good enough. To make matters even, not worse, but stronger, is I believe that in many ways the stakes are higher than ever when it comes to education, especially in Jewish day school. There's a concept called degree inflation, which is the idea that degrees over time, as more and more people earn them, get less and less valuable and earn you less and less of a competitive edge. So here are some stats to think about. So 100 years ago, only 10% of people had a high school diploma. So if you had one, great, you're basically set for life with a high school diploma. Not only are you definitely going to get a job, you're probably going to get a managerial job so you can supervise all the people who don't. Now, 10% of the population doesn't have a high school diploma, and even if you have a high school diploma, that barely qualifies you for manual or menial labor in most industries. Crazy statistic that I just read is that 65% of job postings for executive secretaries, executive assistants require that applicants have a bachelor's degree, except only 19% of secretaries or assistants currently have bachelor's degrees. 30% of college graduates in 2005 ended up taking a job that didn't require a college degree, which means that people are incurring tons and tons of debt, trying to secure more and more degrees, and those degrees aren't necessarily guaranteeing anything. Combine that with the fact that schools like Cornell University now accept half the percentage of students that they did just 13 years ago. And even if you get into these schools, that doesn't necessarily guarantee anything either. Only 57% of U.S. law school graduates in 2013 were employed full-time in a job that required a law degree. And so the stakes are getting higher and higher and higher as the world gets faster. The expectations on education are getting faster, are getting higher, even though education may or may not be able to catch up to that. Now, for the Jewish community, I think the stakes are high as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on these statistics, but these are from the Pew study that probably many of you heard of a few years ago. The greatest generation, which are kind of people in their older years by now, 93% of older Jews identify as Jews by religion, only 68% of millennials identify as Jews by religion, and Jews by no religion are more likely to not be connected to Jewish organizations, not raise their children Jewish, not marry Jews, etc. Approximately 1/4 of those who were raised Orthodox are no longer Orthodox, while only 4% of conservative Jews are now Orthodox. So, in order to be current, Jewish day schools need to be a lot of things. They need to be engaging, they need to be fast-paced, they need to be data-driven, they need to be personalized, and they need to be practical and connected to the real world. So I want to give a quick overview of how our organization does that, and then identify some other examples and cool things that are out there. So we developed a model called 2 Sigma Education, which is an education model right now for elementary school, K through 5, focused around the idea of maximizing the quality and quantity of time students spend learning one-on-one and in small groups. And the reason that we focus on this is because of research that shows that students who learn one-on-one or in small groups with a teacher perform significantly better than any other type of teaching model that has been researched. And not just better than students in a traditional classroom, better than all the other initiatives that were tested. In fact, not just better, a lot better. The average tutored student performs better than 96% of students in a traditional classroom. And the issue is that that's very nice, but it's not necessarily feasible to give every kid, right? So there's 50 million students in the US, we're not going to hire 50 million tutors. So what do we do about this? So this is Benjamin Bloom, a very famous, popular education psychologist and researcher from the University of Chicago. And he posed the question, which he called the 2 sigma problem. 2 sigmas, 2 standard deviations. That was the effect size of one-on-one tutoring for those of you who are statistically minded. And so the question is, can we do this? Is there a way to do the impossible, which is to take students in a traditional classroom and make them experience education and the impact of education as if they were being tutored? And to do so, he identified 6 different reasons why tutoring works, 6 different components that make tutoring as effective as it is. Diagnosing diagnosing what you know and what you don't know before you start. Right? These are all things that a good tutor will do. Constantly checking to make sure you know what you're learning. Immediate feedback and correction. If you don't understand something, great, the tutor's going to fix it immediately. Progression based on mastery. Right? A tutor will never say, okay, so you didn't quite get that, but we got to move on to the next thing. Right? Tutors don't have to do that. And student participation ownership, it's very hard to fall through the cracks when you're the only student there. And positive reinforcement and feeling good. Again, this is what a good tutor does. Just because you put an adult in front of a child, it doesn't mean that this is going to happen. It's got to be someone that kind of knows what they're doing and is actually good at this. So our vision, which I used to call the Holy Grail until I found out that that's an extremely Christian concept. So we'll call it the Holy Kiddush Cup, is to for teachers and administrators to be able to use reliable, actionable data on a daily basis to meet student needs and ensure students' growth. And if you noticed from the slide before, a whole bunch of those 6 things are actually way more possible now than ever before because of the availability and understanding of data. So lots of schools have this goal, right? This is a wonderful goal. I can't imagine any school that would think this was a bad idea. But that doesn't mean that it's so simple, right? So why aren't schools doing this? Well, there's a lot, actually, achieving this vision is not just one project or one thing, right? There's actually a lot of steps that have to go right. Therefore, a lot of things that could possibly go wrong in getting to this point. And so I'd like to go through a quick kind of pyramid of them to have tools. So first of all, you have to have a way to collect the data. Then you have to actually collect the data. Just because you have a way to collect the data doesn't mean it's being collected. Just because it's collected doesn't mean that the data is good or reliable, right? We've seen students log into other students' accounts, right? So then you're getting data from one student, thinks the other, or siblings logging into each other's accounts, or parents doing their kids' homework. That's bad data. Kid has a bad day, doesn't know what they're supposed to do, etc. Access and delivery. So you could have data, it could be wonderful, it could be perfectly accurate. You have to be, the person who actually has the ability to make a decision and do something about it, has to be able to access it. Right? So you have to somehow get the data. Then you see all these numbers and you have to figure out, okay, so of all these numbers, which ones are important? Right? That's a whole other step. Then you have to say, okay, so I see something interesting here. So now, what does that mean? What am I supposed to do about it? Right? So it's not just like, oh, well, that's interesting. That kid isn't doing very well. I have to know, right, what to do about that. And the last thing, which is the real goal here, is targeted teaching. Right? Is to be able to get to a point where not only do you have what you need, you know what you're supposed to do about it, and then you actually can do something about it. And teachers are superheroes, but they're also human. And to ask an individual of any sort to do all of those things on a daily basis is definitely too much, and teachers have limits. So what do we do to make this easier? So first of all, we have adaptive learning software that we choose for schools. That is those are the assessment tools to be able to collect the data, which is obviously in addition to the data that teachers already collect, which we also use. Then we have to figure out how this data is going to be collected. So this is a traditional elementary school classroom. When you think about classroom design, I try to think about, teachers do all kinds of different things, and they manage their classroom and have all kinds of different types of learning activities, but you can't have a classroom that's optimized for all of those things, right? The classroom is going to be set up for one thing, and they're not going to be moving all the furniture around and redecorating on a daily basis, right? So when you look at a classroom like this, so I would ask, is small group instruction or one-on-one instruction possible? Sure. Is it easy or comfortable? Probably not. This classroom, I would say, is optimized for kind of frontal teaching, like I'm doing right now. Right? This is our classroom, and I'll show you a few real pictures, but this is just to give you a diagram. Right? We are optimizing the layout of the classroom so that small group instruction is the norm. Does that mean that a teacher will never stand up and talk to the entire class? Of course, that happens sometimes, but as you can tell, that's probably not the most comfortable or natural way to use this classroom, and that is by design. So here are a few pictures of what a classroom like this might look like. This is from one of our schools. They're not professional pictures. You have teachers working in small group of students, and you have other students on the computer doing work that is adaptive to their needs and collecting data that is then fed back to the teachers. And what that results in is, if we set all that up properly, is you have a classroom where data is being collected on a constant basis and reliably. Then we provide methodology and training, and we also provide reports. So what we'll do is we'll take the data from those providers and not only give them to teachers, but also find the important things inside of them and give those to teachers. And now we're actually pushing to the next level, which is to say, not only here's what's interesting, here's what you can do about it, right? And so really what you end up with is a teacher who can focus on the thing that they signed up for, which is teaching, right? Which is, here's a kid, here's what he knows, here's what he doesn't know, please go help him, right? And this classroom, which is again optimized for small group and individual instruction, really makes it possible to do that. So quickly, using this model, we've been able to start 2 new schools, Yeshivat Atid, Westchester Torah Academy, which you may have heard of. Together they now have 415 students, average tuition discount 40-50%, and they've saved $6.5 million for their parents, not to mention competing schools that then reacted to it. We also started developing a model for established schools. And our first school was Hebrew Academy of Long Beach, HALB, which we launched a few years ago. Kindergarten through 4th grade was about 500 students, and in 1st through 4th grade, which is the elementary school, they just announced that they saved $450,000 a year as a result of this. And we also measure the achievement of our students from beginning to the end of the year using a nationally normed standardized test. And over the course of this past year, and this is 750 students across all of our schools, they made more academic progress in reading than 93% of students nationwide, and more academic progress. Right? This is progress, not level. We can get into that later if anybody's interested in the distinction. This is how much growth they make from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and more progress in math than 99% of US students. So I could talk for hours about what we do, but I want to touch on some other ideas out there, because I really love to talk about, I call them the concept cars, right? So these are like the extreme ideas, and I think concept cars are great, not because necessarily that's exactly what you're going to do, but because they give you concepts, they give you ideas and extremes, and you take a little bit here, a little bit there, and kind of mix them together and find something that works. So we'll go through these quickly. Teach to One Math, run by New Classrooms, which is a model for middle school math. Students come into the room, they look at a screen, it basically tells them what an algorithm decides what they're learning, where they're learning, how they're learning, and who's supposed to be working with them. They knock down all the walls and everybody comes in. It's a pretty cool thing to see, and extraordinarily personalized. High Tech High, believe it or not, that is a school. And it is a school in San Diego, and High Tech High's focus is on project-based learning, meaning as much of the learning as possible is actually integrated into projects as opposed to teaching and tests and homework, etc. Everything's trying to be hands-on and real world, connected to the real world, and trying to actually create things and present them to the community, which is why if you walk through the halls, you'll see a lot of glass and you'll see a lot of things that are being presented or have been presented, and they actually had to create their own teacher training school because they didn't find that any teacher training schools properly prepared teachers to teach in this model. P-Tech has a technical training focus. It's a 6-year program, and when you're done, you actually end up with not only lots of experience and knowledge specifically related to technology, but also an associate's degree. New American Academy, which actually has absolutely nothing to do with technology, but just kind of out of the box thinking. Every classroom has 60 students and 4 teachers. There's a few schools actually in Brooklyn. And just reimagining how school organization structures and career pathways for teachers work. Sudbury Valley School, which has been around forever, which is a private school off in Massachusetts. They are focused on educational freedom. They actually have no traditional classes, no traditional classrooms. Students basically do whatever they want and learn whatever they want all day long. I kid you not, it's fascinating. Read a whole book about it. Something a little less extreme is the Independent Project, which I think is also in Massachusetts, where just for senior year, in the context of a regular school, students have the option to take an elective where basically they are just learning what interests them and doing a huge project around it over the course of their senior year. So what about Jewish concept cars? So they are admittedly harder to find, a lot harder to find, and there are a few different reasons for that. I think that we in general as a community are more conservative. I think in some ways we have more to lose. A lot of innovation happens when you have a school district or a school system that's just completely failing their kids. So somebody says, I'll try something new, who's with me? Everybody says, well, it can't possibly be worse than that. So they all come with you and suddenly you have your experiment running. Jewish day schools, fortunately, are pretty good overall, and so we don't have people kind of rushing to make huge changes. I think there's also an issue of less time. Right? We just have more to cover in less time. The most limited resource in Jewish education for sure is not money, it is time. And less leeway to experiment, etc. But there are, I think, some cool pockets of things going on and that have been going on. There's Yeshiva Lab School, which just opened in Philadelphia with a constructivist model. So similar idea to High Tech Iowa is for little kids right now is that everything is about constructing your own knowledge and building and hands-on, etc. Real School, which I don't know if it exists anymore, started by Tikva Wiener, who's now at Maggie David, but before you guys stole her, she was in Frisch in New Jersey running something called Real School, which was actually an after-school program where students formed teams around things that they wanted to learn and created their own projects and did what they wanted to do, whether it was app design, video making, etc. Futz Mizrahi School in Cleveland has rebuilt their entire Tanakh curriculum around essential questions. So instead of learning your Tanakh straight through, then there are other schools that do this as well. I want to end with two big takeaways here. Two takeaways. Okay, so the first is and versus instead of. So I make a distinction between and ideas and instead of ideas. So and ideas are ideas that supplement things you're already doing. They might be wonderful, helpful, etc. And they're nice to have. You add them to what you're already doing. Instead of ideas, I think are more powerful. These are ideas that actually replace whatever you were doing before, right? So when you got your smartphone, your first smartphone, it totally replaced the stupid phone that came before it, right? You didn't really need that anymore. So what are some instead of ideas in education? So these are some instead of ideas in your real life, right? So baby carrier, dustbuster, coffee machine, these are all things that replace whatever it was that you had or were doing before. Instead of ideas in education, instead of listening to a lecture, watch a video, instead of learning history chronologically, learn it through current events. And instead of waiting 3 weeks until you take your test, get assessed every day as we discussed. And a few years ago, I actually started an initiative to try to launch a high school in New Jersey. I got together a group of parents. We had a total blank slate. We said, okay, so you could design your own high school from scratch. What would it look like? What would you keep? What would you change? What would you add? And the answer was actually very simple. It was, we want all the cool new things that schools today are not doing, but we also want all the things that they already do. Right? Everything. Okay, how do you expect to do that? So I think that the power of instead of ideas is also sometimes the scary part, which is that they require trade-offs, right? Which is that sometimes you might have to live without something that you were used to, right? Yes, you can spend a lot more time learning programming and real-world subjects, but you might have to sacrifice something that you're used to having on your schedule, right? You might be able to go more in depth and project-based, etc., but you might cover less material. Your iPhone might be thinner and waterproof, but it's not going to have a headphone jack, right? So all of these types of ideas require a certain amount of willingness to give up something, and that's when it becomes difficult. So when we keep piling ideas, and I think there's a tendency in education to just, we take what they have and we say, okay, well, we want you to do this also. Okay, and then that, and then that, and then that. You kind of forget what was at the bottom, and school just becomes all these things that you've now piled on top, and they just become incredibly complex organizations. This is how they become expensive in many cases. They're impossible to manage and supervise, and everyone is overworked because there's just so many things going on. But I think if we think differently, there are ideas out there, right? There are cool ideas, there are concept ideas, there are smaller ideas. Schools can completely transform, they can do pockets of it, we have limited time, but the question shouldn't just be what can we add, it should be what can we do differently. And the last thing I will say, to go back to what I said earlier, the world is changing at a rapid pace and accelerating, and there's no way to know for sure what the world's going to look like in 5 years, let alone 15 years. We don't know what knowledge is going to be useful, we don't know what jobs are going to be available, but we do know that there are certain skills and abilities that probably will always be valuable. Critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, resilience, and I'm sure you can think of more. And of course, schools should be thinking about these things, and I'm assuming most people in this room are not the principal of Yeshiva Flatbush High School, but many more people in this room are probably parents, and parents should be thinking about these things too. And we as parents, we partner with schools, and whether you realize it or not, Jewish day schools are actually very responsive to their parents. They kind of have to be, because parents pay all their bills and staff the board and donate money. So I think it's important to think about this as yourself, as you actually have a voice, and you actually do impact what happens in the school, even if you're not actively involved. And just think about, like, when you praise a school, what are you praising it for? When you criticize a school, what are you criticizing it for? Those things are being listened to. You're giving feedback to schools each and every day, and even if you're not saying anything, that's also giving a school feedback to some extent. So I encourage you to use that voice to encourage your schools to take some risks, try something new, and just like kids, make them feel like it'll be okay, right? That they can, that they're comfortable doing it, because you're not going to jump on them if something, unfortunately doesn't work, because that's what happens in experimentation. So in the end, it's all one big partnership. It's overwhelming, it's complicated, but we need to keep our students engaged, we need to keep them inspired, challenged, motivated, and we need to prepare them for a world that we don't fully understand and we've never seen. But if we keep an open mind, embrace the possibility of doing things differently, sometimes failing, and stick to what we know to be fundamental and important, then I think that parents and schools can partner together to make sure that our children are getting the best education they could possibly get. Thank you.
How refreshing is that, and how great of a presentation. Thank you, Jeff, for being here. If anybody has particular questions to Jeff until we invite Rabbi Harari up and Rabbi Akitelo up to the stage, you can do that now while I just put a few chairs over here. And thank you again for such a thorough and refreshing presentation. It's so nice to think about education with a smile and to get it in such a beautiful delivery. We do have principals in the audience, you should know. And I think your contribution...
I like principals.
And hopefully you piqued a little bit of interest. You want to take the questions while I just a little...
Sure, yeah.
So, you mentioned how you were able to reduce the cost of education. How does that tie into what you were doing? How were you able to accomplish this?
So, I think there are a few things here, but fundamentally in terms of the education model, a lot, and we're talking so far about elementary schools, but what you have in most elementary schools is you have kind of this core. You have a classroom full of kids, you have a teacher, maybe an assistant, and that's the core of the education. And then in many cases, that's not enough, because there's X number of kids, And any teacher will tell you, I've yet to see a class, and we measure this, right? I've yet to see a class where there are fewer than 3 different grade levels worth of kids in one class, right? Just statistically speaking, if not more. And so the teachers really struggle to find a way to meet the needs of all those kids. And schools end up having to supplement what goes on in the classroom because the teachers are only human and they're given this wide range of kids. And those costs really add up. And so what we try to accomplish with our model is to be able to take what's going on in the classroom and just maximize the number and range of students that those teachers in the classroom can manage and give the proper amount of attention and support to. Yeah.
I have like 3 comments. Some are comments, some questions. Pick any of you want that you want to answer. The first is that the presentation really didn't speak to Jewish schools except for the last part. It seems like most of what you're talking about is changing education, not necessarily Jewish education. And it's an important distinction to make, whether it's just an observation or whether you want to address it and how it seems like you're really focused on more Jewish day schools in our world rather than the broader Jewish system, broader Jewish education system. And then speaking to that point, I think that the issue that we experience, or at least intuitively we experience in our communities, is that there's a socioeconomic issue at play where families with different income levels are all participating in this private school system, partially subsidized by philanthropy, partially subsidized by parents who may not have sort of clear picture of what things are costing, and just the issue that communities are being very open about absorbing families that may not otherwise go to private schools.
I left 5 minutes ago. You still
I'm still talking. I'm still on the clock. So I think that's something that doesn't necessarily get addressed by this. It's a different question altogether in terms of cost and quality of education. Classroom sizes, we all experience classroom sizes in private schools of 30 kids or more sometimes. So that's the second thing. And then the last thing really is that I think that the most obvious cost that we see in schools is teachers, how much they cost. I wonder how you've measured, you're talking about measurement and data calculation, how much you've seen teacher to student ratios or cost per school as a sort of this number of teachers to students, whether that's come down by way of some things you're implementing, or is it just the same and you're talking about just the supplemental cost that's what the savings is? That may be the more question.
So I'm gonna work backwards, if I can. Mostly because I can remember the last one. So that's okay.
I have to share a room with this guy.
There's when we first started down this path 5 years ago, it was the first realization that was clear to us was that if we wanted to really tackle day school affordability seriously, we had to tackle costs. The second thing is anyone who runs a school or is involved in a school will tell you is that the vast majority of the cost of a school is personnel. I'm going to say teachers because that's a little complicated of who is or isn't counted in that group. But for sure, if you're just talking about salaries and benefits, 80% easily of most schools. And the other thing is that I'm not personally a believer that people who work in schools are tremendously overpaid, right? And so we're not necessarily going to do this by forcing people to work harder or take less money, etc. And so absolutely our approach is to try to do more with less. And it is the supplemental stuff that I mentioned, but it is also being, and I hinted at this, but it's also being able to gradually increase class size. And actually at HALB, they just did that, and that's part of how they were able to reduce their costs. And the administration really honestly believed, they looked at the situation, they said, now we feel that, several years ago, we couldn't do that. That would be educationally detrimental to our kids. Now we think they're totally fine, they're still gonna get what they need.
How many kids are in the class and now?
Oof. It's always a range. I'm saying the maximum, maybe 26. 27. Yeah. It's not a lot. What? Maybe they were going up to 24. It's a school decides what their maximum class size is, but usually your maximum class size is not going to be your is not going to be your average class size. You're not filling up every single class.
My friend.